NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
Meet Uncle Louie. Not technically my uncle, this was actually my father's uncle, Louie Albano. But if you, like me, come from a large Italian family, everyone's either an uncle or a cousin. Uncle Louie was known in my family for three sort of rare and unusual things. The first is that Uncle Louie never left his house without taking a little packet of red crushed chili pepper. And he would put it in his front left pocket. And when he'd be at a buffet or whatever he'd be eating, if he didn't like what he saw, he'd take out his little packet of chili pepper, he'd unfold it, he'd sprinkle it on his food, he'd look up and he'd smile with this smug face on him, and then he would go and eat. And that's because Louie loved to eat, but he loved spicy food more than anything, and Louie would never suffer a bad meal no matter what. The other thing about Louie is that Louie was a meticulous dresser. Louie cared about what he wore ever since he was a young guy. And according to my father, he used to wear perfectly pressed suits. He'd have his little hanky in his thing. At one point in time, he ended up getting into a country western phase, which I think is really strange to think about. And when I knew Louie, he wore nothing but Tommy Bahama. But the point is that Louie would not be caught dead wearing something he didn't pick out. Literally, when his wife went to pick out his suit that he was going to be buried in, Louie had already picked out what he was going to wear in the casket. The last thing about Louie that was just mind-blowing and could never seem to figure it out is that Louie always managed to get the best parking spot. I don't care where we were going. Somehow, Louie always ended up parking up front. And you know it because we'd be parked like 3-4 blocks away, my parents would be fighting and arguing, and we'd be walking in, and there it would be, this white Cadillac with a vanity plate on the back that said, "Oh, Louie." Every time. Don't know how we did it. So why am I telling you about my Uncle Louie? Well, for me, Louie is an emblem of what giving an opening statement is all about. And I discovered that at the end of a long journey that began with me walking back to the council table after I had just absolutely bombed my first opening statement. Friend of mine, colleague of mine in the Miami Public Defender's Office asked me to second chair a case with her. And of course, I said, no problem. And then she asked me, "Hey Guy, do you want to do the opening statement?" "Sure, Kate, no problem, I'll do that." Not a big deal, right? It's just the opening statement. Big mistake. This turned out to be a bad case. This was a case that had bad facts. Our client was riding a bicycle behind a Publix grocery store when he saw a young 17, 18-year-old Haitian male standing outside with his bright Publix employee polo shirt on a cell phone talking to his family back in Haiti, which he did every single day that he got his break. He went outside and he called that family dutifully. Our client sees him while riding the bike and yells out at him, "Hey, Zo." Zo is short for Zo Pound, which is a Haitian gang that our client believed was conspiring against him. When this poor kid heard that and had no idea what he was talking about, he looked up from his cell phone and said nothing back because now he was completely terrified. And our client dropped his bicycle, grabbed a piece of wood, and whips it at this little kid. He misses, grabs another piece of wood, and starts chasing him and beating him down with a piece of wood. To make things even worse, we were trying this case in front of the most prominent Haitian judge in all of Miami. So I came down with something you've probably caught too at one point in your career, right? The opening statement blues. You've all been there. You're like, what on earth am I going to do about this case? How am I going to explain these facts? What am I going to say about this? what do I say about this sympathetic witness? How am I going to motivate this witness to do anything wrong? Do I give my client's crazy version of what happened? I don't know if he's going to testify. And what if I say something that the state's going to pick up and beat me senseless with it? So I wrote myself a prescription. You might be familiar with this. But before I get to that, let me tell you this. Just conceptually speaking, opening statements should not be that hard, right? Because when you read what we're supposed to be doing in opening statement, it says, well, you're just supposed to be telling the jury what the evidence will show. This is not about emotion. It's not about arguments. In fact, the judge looks the jury in the face and says, what they're about to tell you is not evidence. But that's not really what I believed. Because probably like many of you, I've been taught something very different. In fact, my teacher's here, sitting in the front row, already ashamed of what I'm about to tell you. I was taught that opening statement is critical. That this is when you got to introduce that theory of defense. You got to get your themes out there. You got to label the witnesses. This is important. I was taught, just like Jerry Spence says, that opening statement is where you win the case. Now, as a slight aside, in doing research over the years, I came to figure out that this statistic that everyone talks about, where jurors make up their mind, 80% of jurors make up their mind after opening statement, there's really actually no support for that. But the point is that opening statement's incredibly important, and I knew it. But the problem is, I didn't have the answer to this case, and you've all been there. So here's the prescription I wrote for myself. I decided I'll just keep it vague. Raise your hand if you ever told yourself that or heard someone say that, right? I'm going to be real vague in opening. I'll avoid the specifics, and that way, when the actual facts come out, the jury's not going to be looking at me all angry like, yeah. I won't talk about the bad facts, because bad facts are like a broken bone, right? If you bang on it and you jump on it, you're only going to make it worse. I'll hit the law that it's really good to us, and I'll remind the jurors of the burden, and then I'll tell them at the very end, guys, just keep an open mind. Right? You ever hear a defense lawyer say that? Over the years, I've heard some version of this prescription many times, right? Take 2 tablespoons of say nothing. Rest up, stay in bed, don't get out with the facts and the witnesses. Just stay there, lie still. Wrap your head in a warm towel of defense-friendly law and beg for a speedy recovery by asking the jury to keep an open mind. It doesn't work, and it didn't work this time. Here's the play-by-play. I got up there and gave an absolutely incoherent recitation of what facts I can't remember, and I can't tell you a single fact I actually articulated in that moment. Why? Because it was so incoherent, I have no memory of it. What I do remember is the awful feeling of just wanting to be done before I got like 3 words in. And then I quickly moved to the law, but at that point, my heart's racing, I'm already failing, and I'm like that boxer who's just swinging, and I start arguing the law, and everything I'm saying is argumentative. And the prosecutor's objecting, and they're right. And the judge is sustaining everything. So now I've got nothing to say except keep an open mind. But the irony of that is that I had literally just done everything possible to close their minds. Case closed for them. If any of you have ever seen My Cousin Vinny, this was some combination of both of the defense openings in that case. Okay? But there was a ray of hope. There was a little beam of light in the back of the courtroom. As I'm walking back to my defense counsel table, I see my best friend Jimmy sitting back there. Oh, Jimmy. Jimmy's like the smartest lawyer I've ever known and really kind and really loving. So what's going to happen here is I've got a plan. I'm going to go talk to Jimmy, and Jimmy's going to tell me, this is all in your head. It wasn't as bad as you think it was. So we get a break, and I go back to Jimmy, and I walk up to him right away, and I say, Jimmy, how's it going? Jimmy looks up at me. Jimmy had a little bit of a hunch and big, thick glasses, and he was always pushing his glasses up and sniffling, and he grabbed me by the shoulder, and he looked up just over the top of his glasses, and he said, "What the fuck was that?" Of course, I'm trying to delay the inevitable, right? Are you talking about the opening? And then he said what I needed to hear more than anything in my life. He said, "Guy, that's the worst fucking thing I've ever seen." The truth is that I genuinely hope that you all have a Jimmy in your life. Somebody who's going to look you in the face when you've absolutely failed and tell you the truth, no matter how hard that truth is. And you know what? Jimmy was right. Jimmy was very right. Because we spoke to the alternate juror, and this is what that person told me to my face. The alternate juror said, I was a slam dunk guilty until, guess what? The client testified. And he said, no offense, but your arguments and opening statement, I didn't buy any of them. Just think about that for a minute, because I've thought about it for years. This guy was basically telling me that my xenophobic client had done more to convince him to doubt his guilt than I had. This sent me on an absolute warpath to figure out how we deal with this situation. What do we need to do to win an opening statement? What's the point? What are we trying to accomplish? And when you have a moment like this where you just light a fire to everything you know, the old stuff you've learned and you've taught that you unfortunately did not live out comes back and you combine it with the new. And I started watching people open and taking notes. I started volunteering as a mock juror every chance I could. And I was taking notes not for them, but for me. I started reading both in the profession, but outside the profession. And when I got out of the forest of bad opening statements and came upon the temple of great opening statements, there he was, old Louie. See, Louie had it right. Number one, you've got to take on all the bad facts. There's a famous chess motto, which is meet all threats. Louie was right. You don't get up from your defense table unless you have an answer for all the bad food that eventually you're going to have to put in your mouth. Number two, you got to address the witnesses in opening statement. You have to do it, because if you don't do it, they're going to address themselves and the state's going to address them, and I promise you, you're not going to like what they're wearing. But last, you got to figure out how to park all of this stuff right up front in the jury's mind. And that's the question. How do we do that? That's the point of this talk. And you've already heard a lot of people before me talk about storytelling. And that's true. That's ultimately what this is about. So here's where I want to take you. First, I want to try and show you why we must tell a story. Now, you've heard so much about this. I'm going to blaze past this because hopefully at this point, you're convinced this is something we have to do. I'm also going to tell you how to construct an effective story. I struggle and have struggled with this. What do we have to do to tell an effective story? What specifically do we need to do? And then finally, how do we tell an effective story? And at the end, as a bonus, if I have time, I'll tell you how Louie did it, because I figured it out. All right, here's my creed and what I came to understand about opening statement. In the opening, we don't describe reality. That's not what we're doing. What we're doing is we're shaping reality. and reality is shaped by story. We're not getting up and describing reality, we're shaping reality. We're leading the jury to a reality they otherwise would not see, they otherwise would not have. That's the point of opening. And we do that by telling a story in the opening. Okay, now, I'm not a brain surgeon, and I don't imagine anyone in this room is a brain surgeon, unless my former professor, Jay Clark, has changed his profession. And okay, all right. But we all operate on the brain every single day. That's what we do. And so in order to speed through some of this, because we've already heard a lot of this, let me just hit a few highlights as far as opening statement is concerned. Okay? This is where we're trying to go. We're trying to go to the prefrontal cortex. Why? Because the prefrontal cortex orchestrates like all the most important things when it comes to decision making. Now, if you ask Robert Sapolsky, who is the famous neuroscientist at Stanford, no part of the brain does one thing exclusively. But what it does is it sort of manages different actions. And that's what this part does. It manages executive function, long-term planning, memories, working memories, and it regulates emotions. Okay? And it basically orchestrates decision making. The problem is, it's not that easy to find a parking spot in the prefrontal cortex. Why is that? Because it's not directly connected to any of your sensory organs. When you are absorbing information, when raw information and data is coming in, it's being channeled through these intermediary organs, and we heard about that. We've heard about that all day. And something's happening to that information before it actually hits the prefrontal cortex. The question for you is, as someone giving an opening statement, is what the hell is happening to that information? Well, the short answer is this. That information is entering and it's being converted into story form so that your prefrontal cortex can make sense of it. You don't believe me? Let me prove it to you. Here's 3 lines. He went to the store. Fred died. Sharon wept, got hungry and wept. When you read these 3 lines, nothing in these lines says that he is the same person as Fred. But I bet you all decided that before you even thought about it. Nothing in here says that Fred dying had anything to do with Sharon weeping and going hungry. But you told the story. Your brain just did that without asking your permission. Here's another great example. Has anyone ever seen this picture before? Awesome. Okay. When you see this picture, what do you tell yourself is going on? Big guy, angry big guy is chasing little guy, right? Who's terrified. That's a big problem. Because guess what? Big guy and little guy are exactly the same. If you had cut these 2 figures out and you laid them over the top of each other, they would be the same height and they would have the exact same facial expressions. Your brain manipulated the information to work with the story that it wanted to tell. So bottom line is this. We don't tell stories to escape reality. We actually tell stories to construct reality. That's how our brains think. So I'm pushing this further than anyone has told you so far because I believe this to be true based on what I have read. We actually think in story. And so what happens is this. Story becomes like this biological interstate highway system inside of your brain. If you get on that interstate, you're going straight where you want to go. But if you don't, you got a problem. So here's what happens if you don't tell a story in opening. Best case scenario is that the jury's just going to ignore you because the cognitive overload that Jennifer Saletti told us about is because the prefrontal cortex is an absolute resource hog. It is the Humvee of the brain. And it's just going to ignore you because it's too much work. It's like trying to gather a bunch of groceries without a cart. But worst case scenario is way more terrifying than that, which is this, that when you leave the story open-ended for the jury, when you don't address the bad facts and you don't address the witnesses, what the studies show is this. The human brain will create a story that is more negative than positive. It will almost always go negative. Why is that? Well, it makes sense. If you don't know what's going on in the world, you definitely want to presume negative things about it. If some random person comes and sits next to you on a bench and you don't know why, It's way safer to think that they have bad intentions rather than good ones. But this is terrifying for us as advocates because guess what? Jurors come into our trial already designed and ready to go with certain images and certain stories they're telling about us and our clients, right? So if you want to use the parking metaphor to think this through, here's where the judge gets to park for the jury, right? Beautiful spot. Here's the prosecutor. Guess where we're parking? Way back there. All right, bad news. But here's the good news. Every brain has a spot reserved for the best storyteller. It's true. If you write one thing down from this presentation, make it be this: that the only way to overcome a story is to tell a better one. That's it. That's the secret. I'm not going to talk about what happens when to our brain chemistry because we've heard about the Uri Hassan study from Princeton with the neural coupling. You've heard Paul Zach's presentation about the neurotransmitters and the hormones. Has anyone seen the monkey illusion? Oh my gosh, nobody. Okay, one person. I have to show it.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white passed the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes.
Did you get it right?
Did you spot the gorilla?
Whoops.
For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla.
Who missed the gorilla? Raise your hand, admit it.
If
Yep,
you
me
knew
too.
about the gorilla, you probably saw it.
It's so embarrassing.
But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion.
Okay. So, here's the point of that, right? You ever had a lawyer come in after losing a trial and just be totally baffled by how the jury missed the reasonable doubt that they just thought was there? Has anyone had that experience? Yeah, plenty of times, right? That's because here's what's going on. Prosecutor walks in with a story to tell and the jury's all ready to play their role. What's that story? Count how many times the ball's being passed between the white shirts. Right? This is a story of guilt, ladies and gentlemen. Your job is to watch the evidence, pile it all up, and then find the guy guilty at the end. And we're over there, and our job is to tell them, no, a freaking gorilla of reasonable doubt is about to cross the stage, and you have to be on the lookout. Because what happens is this: when you change this story, if I would have told you all that there was a gorilla who was going to come out on the stage and that this was an illusion and you were going to miss it, you would have caught it. That's the goal of opening statement. You change the story, you change the reality, and you watch and you catch the gorilla. So bottom line is this: we think in stories. You can only replace a story with a better one. Story triggers memory, emotion, and engagement. And you can influence people with stories by coupling them and triggering cortisol and oxytocin, which are connected to focus and empathy. Not telling a story is going to lead to some bad things. And story is the only way to get the best spot in the juror's mind and to change their reality during the trial. Great, guy. Awesome. Let's go home. No. How do you tell a good story? This is really not that easy. I don't know about you guys, but I have heard about Joseph Campbell more than I care to admit. And I still don't get it. Carl Jung is unreadable. I don't know what archetypes are. And if I look at one more squiggly line talking about rising action and falling, that's not helping me, and it didn't help me. Flannery O'Connor has a great quote that I find that people know what a story is until they sit down to write one. So what's helped me and what I want to share with you is the work of Kendall Haven, who you've heard about. Here's why. Haven and his team tried to figure out exactly what components a story has to have in order to be compelling. And how'd they do it? They hooked people up to a brain scanner and figured out what was actually firing the brains, the regions of the brain that you want to. So here's those elements. And we all love elements because we're lawyers, right? These are the actual things that a story has to have, the actual ingredients that a story has to have in order to work. Now, if you're really interested in these, you should buy the book and you should read them. I have a lot of references in the written materials. You're welcome to dig deeper. I'm going to just highlight a couple of areas for you that are meaningful, I think, to us. Theory and themes. The point of a theory in telling a good story is, what is the purpose of this story? Raise your hand if you've ever had someone come into your office and just start dumping on you, right? It's exhausting. It's exhausting because you don't know what the hell they want. Why are they telling you the story? Why does this matter to you? That's the point of the theory. It's the purpose of the story. Why are we telling the jurors this? We're telling the jurors this story because they need to know how an innocent person ended up being accused of a crime. People overcomplicate theory, in my opinion. I've heard a number of definitions of theory, big paragraphs, a whole bunch of fancy language. Here's what a theory is, okay? It's the shortest possible explanation for why a person who didn't do it or shouldn't be found guilty, right, ended up being called a criminal defendant. It's like if someone comes up to you and says, how do I get to the highway? You give that person the shortest possible explanation so that they don't get lost. That's exactly what a theory is. Now, it has to have all the critical elements. It has to have all of these story elements, and it's got to have punch, and it's got to work. You can't get lost if you follow the theory, but that's what it does. The themes are the persistent components of that journey that you want people to be aware of throughout the trip, right? Stay in the right lane the whole time. That's the theme of giving someone directions to get to the highway. But for us, those themes take a different form. Themes are persistent qualities of human beings and justice that we want the jury to think about throughout the trip. And we need to introduce both of these early in the opening statement and then repeat them. I think there's two types of themes, and I'm going to give you just a bit of introduction to that. I think there's themes about human behavior, okay, and justice. Themes about human behavior explain why people act the way they do. They're little pithy statements that have a lot of profundity per square inch. A drowning man will clutch at straw. When you're drowning and you're suffocating, you don't care what you reach out for, no matter how insubstantial or how unlikely it is to help you. That's a great theme for a snitch case. Misery seeks company. When people are down, they want to bring other people down with them. Blood is thicker than water, right? If you have family members who corroborate testimony. Some good justice themes that I've used and that I really like: doubt, and you won't be deceived. As long as you doubt, no one's going to pull the wool over your eyes. You find the truth by comparing the lies. A lie runs fast, but the truth runs marathons. Probably heard some variation of that. And remember, because don't remember, but I'm going to tell you, and I think we heard this earlier as well, I think this was in Chris's talk, that the jury becomes a character in the story. And these are themes about what they have to do. All right, now, every story is about a character, but a good story is about a character, right? We want characters just like we want people, like the way that we buy a home, right? You ever hear people talk about what kind of house they want? They want a house with character. What are they telling us? We want something unique about this person. We want something interesting. So when you tell a story about characters, you gotta have something unique or interesting about that character. How do you do that in a criminal case? Well, first of all, you have to be interested in the people that you're working with and you're talking to, including your client and the witnesses you're talking to. And you're not always gonna know why they're interesting, but I promise you it'll come up. I had a great case not that long ago where I tried a sex assault where the older brother rather, was in the house the whole time. And the theory was that none of this was happening because if the brother had seen it, he would have done something about it. Well, in the investigation, I figured out and learned that this young kid was a big football player, and guess what position he played on the field? Linebacker. What do linebackers have to do? They have to keep their head on a swivel, and they have to hit what they see. Also, characters are a great way to enter a story, especially an opening statement. If you have a story that involves some unique characteristic, like some feature or physical feature that doesn't allow this person to actually do what they're accused of, that's a great entryway into your story. The jury's going to be a character, and they're going to be what Haven calls the climax character. The climax character comes in at the pivotal moment to rescue the protagonist who can't help him or herself. Okay? Do not forget that. All right, let's talk about goals. Seems like a simple concept, right? Story is about a character who has a goal. Well, a goal has to be external in order for a story to work. They have to be actually trying to get something, trying to achieve something. What is it? That's your job to define. But once that character either achieves that goal or doesn't, that's the story. The story's over. That's what we're looking for. But goal is actually way more complicated and much more important than that. And this is where advocates really screw this up. Because goal orients the plot. When we know the goal, we know what people are doing. Imagine a Martian comes down to Earth and watches a soccer game but can't see the goals. That Martian's going to spend a long time trying to figure out what the hell those guys are doing. And this is how this works in story form as well. And I'm going to show you. So here is a story. We're going to read it together. Sally let loose a team of gophers. The plan backfired when a dog chased them away. She then threw a party, but the guests failed to bring the motorcycles. Furthermore, her stereo system was not loud enough. Sally spent the next day looking for a peeping Tom, but was unable to find one in the yellow pages. Obscene phone calls gave her some hope until the number was changed. It was the installation of blinking neon lights across the street that finally did the trick. Sally framed the ad from the classified section and now has it hanging on her wall. Does anyone have any idea what the hell this is talking about? Yeah, this is better than my first opening. How about now? What if I tell you that Sally's goal is to get rid of her neighbor? Just watch what happens. It all makes sense, right? She's letting out gophers. She's trying to have a party, but nobody's got any loud motorcycles. Her stereo system's just not loud enough. She goes looking for some creeper to come and look into the house, but there's no yellow page thing. All of a sudden it's like, boom, I get it. That's the power of the goal. That's the power of laying out the goal. Now, what happens in practice is we screw this up. Here's a typical prosecutor opening, right? No goal. On December 10th, police responded to a call at whatever address. When they arrived, Vanessa, the victim, told them that the defendant got off work and went home where Vanessa was. They started arguing and he hit her. Vanessa will tell you he hit her in the face, causing bruising and cuts. At the hospital, he sent her a text telling her he was sorry. Okay, great. What's everyone trying to accomplish? We don't know. Here's how the defense responds. Mark left work like he always did. He went home. He said goodnight to his kids. He grabbed a beer and sat down to watch TV. Vanessa started to question him about why he was late. She started an argument and hit him. He defended himself by pushing her back. Okay, not bad, right? We humanized the client. He's getting off of work. He's having his beer. This is a self-defense case. But nobody's talked about their goals. Here's what a goal-driven opening looks like in this case. All Vanessa wanted was for Mark to feel the same pain she did. To admit he was cheating, realize he'd hurt her, and regret it. Really regret it. It started with her questioning him. It elevated to hitting when he didn't get it. And it finished with her calling the police and lying about what happened when he had said, you know what, I've had enough. We're done. Now everyone knows what the game plan is. We know where the goals are. Characters have to be motivated to achieve their goals. Seems obvious, except motive is maybe the most important factor in the mix. And that's because studies show that motive controls empathy. Motive controls antipathy. When you dial motive in, you can literally change how the jury responds to the characters in your story. We heard Jennifer Sleddy give an amazing opening statement. right? And what she was doing in that opening statement, when she started off by saying, I think it was, oh fuck, I can't remember exactly what was said, was she was trying to figure out how to tell the jury that the motivation for that statement was not what the state was saying it was. And that was the key to her opening. You need to understand that motive has to match the level and the goals that we're talking about in an opening story. So if we have somebody lying to the police, right, their motive has to match that decision to do that. And the secret here is you need to ask why and you need to say because. You got to ask why and say because. When you are thinking about writing your opening statement, you have to constantly ask why. Why are there bruises? Why report to the police at all? Why is she crying? And you got to go after those answers. And I'll give you some tricks to that. But then you got to say because. Because when you do that, that's where you explain motive. So just to give you an idea of how powerful this is, you've all heard the story of Jean Valjean, right? Here's one Jean Valjean. The French king is oppressing the common people with taxes and limited food rations. Jean Valjean, unable to feed his family, cannot sit by and watch his daughter starve. So he steals a loaf of bread. We like that, Jean. No problem, man. Take whatever you need, right? Jean has always been lazy and refuses to grow up. He doesn't like being told what to do and hates being asked to do anything. When he's hungry, he steals from others who do hard work and struggle to make a living. Lock this guy up. Okay? They have the exact same goal. They have a different motive. You have a completely different response to them. Stories start to get interesting when a character who's driven to obtain some goal, right, because they're motivated for some reason, they run into a problem. Everybody who saw Apollo 11 or Apollo 13? Apollo 13, geez, knows that when Tom Hanks said, Houston, we have a problem, that's when that movie got started. Like up until that point, everyone was fine going and refilling their popcorn and their soda. But the minute Tom Hanks said, Houston, we have a problem, butts were glued. And that's because that's where the story comes into play. That's what we care about. How do they solve this problem? And conflicts are between people. And that's a subset of problems. Every story's got to have this. One note I want to make about this as advocates, especially an opening statement, is this. First you got to clear the garden. What do I mean by clearing the garden? When you get a police report, right, it is rife with weeds, the state's problems and conflicts. I told the defendant to stop. I spoke to him in polite language. I tried to get him to come outside. I tried to get him to tell the truth. We hear about the victim's problems and conflicts. The victim tried to de-escalate, tried to say, stop, please. What you have to do is you have to rip those weeds out, especially in opening statement, by addressing each and every one of them and say, no, he was not trying to de-escalate. That officer was the cause of the escalation. Or you need to tell the jury that the victim really didn't want to get away. If she wanted to do that, she would have done X, Y, Z. She would have called police right away. Whatever your theory of defense is. And by doing that, then you can allow your problems and your conflicts in your story to grow and to thrive in the story. Risk and danger is associated with tension. This is what makes stories really, really tense. This is what triggers the cortisol, which is the focus chemical. And, you know, our cases have a ton of risk and danger. What is risk? Risk is the likelihood of failure for the character, and danger is what happens to that character if they do fail. There's a reason why you can turn the television on and at any given time in the day, and you'll catch a criminal drama, right? It's because our stories have a lot of risk and danger. But in our opening statements, we need to bring in a new element of risk and danger, and that's the element of what happens here if the jury gets it wrong. What happens if they convict an innocent person? That's how we ring liberty's bell. And that's how we cause them to focus in the way we need them to. Okay. We paint the story with details. Once we have this information and we're going to tell the story, we need to do it in details. And this is something that we've already talked about, and some of the other presenters have talked a lot about. So I'm not going to say a ton about it, other than to say this. Kendall Haven describes it as our spotlight. This is our tool, and especially an opening statement. This is the tool we've been given, a giant spotlight, and we get to shine it on all the little facts we want. I have to tell you about, has anyone heard of the curse of knowledge? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, a few people. The curse of knowledge is that when you know something, when you're familiar with something, you're cursed by that knowledge. You literally cannot think about what it would be like not to know it. And that's a problem for us as advocates, and it's a problem in opening statement, and it crushes people in opening. Why? Because all the things they know in their head, all the motivations, all the doubts, all the little bits and pieces that they think, everyone else knows it. And it's really hard to get out from underneath this. But the way you do it is by focusing on details. Details will take you out, because as you focus on details and as you shine your spotlight and you take yourself into that moment, the way that Keith Belzer talked about, and the way we did when we talked about the place of interest, when we were describing it to our partner, when we do that, this is how we circumvent the curse of knowledge. Okay. Quick shortcut. In order to actually write a story in opening, what I do and what I strongly encourage you to do is start with your closing. And I'm going to give you 2 reasons why. The first is that closing argument is the most open forum or form that we have as advocates. You heard Keith talk about that. And because of that, what happens is when we approach closing argument, we put our storytelling brain to work. You got this machine, might as well power it up. So as you start to answer the why questions, as you start to make your arguments, what's happening is your brain's telling the story you want to write. The second reason why I think this works is because once you do that and you have all of those answers, you know what the end of the story is. And the best storytellers will always tell you that you have to know the ending before you can start with the beginning. And once you know where you're going, you just grab the keys of the car and you just start driving. You just take that spotlight on and you start telling them each and every one of the details that gets them to the end. All right. So I had a lot of information about how to tell a story, but I mean, when you follow someone like Keith Belzer, you just have to be humble about it. And you just have to realize that no one's going to tell you how to tell a story better than Keith, at least as far as the audible storytelling stuff. But I'm going to hit some highlights that for me really matter. Okay, number 1, you've got to sing in tune. What does this mean? You've probably heard someone tell you that 93% of all communication is physical. That's incorrect. That's not true. What the studies show is that when the message between the verbal and the physical becomes incongruent, then the listener breaks down meaning and weighs it differently. And they weight it according to this formula. So in other words, if you've ever seen somebody almost comically say, I'm really getting tired of your lip. If you don't stop, I'm going to hurt you. But they're shaking and they're, you don't buy it. You don't buy it. That's what this means. Why is this important? Well, it's important because you got to think about what you're doing when you stand up and give an opening statement in a criminal case. What are you doing? You're telling the jury that this is a freaking tragedy. Somebody is being prosecuted for something they didn't do or they didn't quite do. Whatever the case is, it is an absolute tragedy. And if they don't hear that in your voice, if they don't see that in your physical mannerisms, you're going to get shredded. You will get shredded. And you've seen bad opening statements like this. People get up and they give a weak-kneed opening. And the jury smells it out because of this. You are the most important juror in every single case. If you don't convince yourself first, how on earth do you expect another juror to buy a single thing you have to say? And I tell myself, my conviction is what prevents theirs. And by the way, when I refer to theirs, I wanted to say something earlier when I talked about character. You know who's not a character in a story? Quote unquote, my client. Never refer to them as my client. So, this is J. Tony Serra. I don't know how many people are familiar with him. He's kind of an idol of mine. I'll probably never have a chance to meet him. Focus on what Tony Serra does with his voice, with his hands, with his body leaning, and with his eyes.
I'm sorry that the defense never rests, but I happen, in this case, I happen to represent an innocent man. Not a technically not guilty man, but an innocent man.
You think he believes that? Right? The message is there. Now, you don't have to take it up to this level of volume, okay? You don't have to be at a 12. But you better be up, and you got to be congruent. Okay. Keith talked to you a little bit about eye contact. I'm going to just kind of dive into this a little bit more. You have power in your eyes, more than you probably realize. Why? Because our eyes look like this. We have something that no other primate has, which is a non-pigmented sclera. Why on earth do we have that? That is a very bad adaptive trait. Because what happens is that other animals can now see what you're looking at. Oh shit. This is why poker players wear glasses. But why do we have this trait? We have it, according to the best theories that we got right now, because we have something called shared intentionality. What does this mean? As people, we can actually look at each other and share an intention, meaning we both have the same goal, we can develop the same goal. And this is crazy. There's a guy named Dr. Michael Tomasello who says you will never see two chimps carrying a log in the forest together to help each other out. But you can watch a video of a 2-year-old human being look at an adult and immediately intervene and start playing the game. That's the power of our eyes. So in an opening statement, when you walk up to that jury and you look out over to them, this is not just some formality. You are triggering a reciprocity response in them, and they are connecting with you and being like, oh shit, he's looking at me. What's the game plan here? I need to figure this out. And when you open your eyes up, that's a sign of trust. Have you ever had somebody that you didn't think believed you? What do you say to them? Look at me. And you lean in and those eyes pop open. That's because evolution built us to know that when you open your eyes up to somebody, you're vulnerable. And in an opening statement, you better damn well be vulnerable. You're telling them, listen, trust me. Okay. Arms. Which one of these guys do you want to listen to? Like, does anyone want to listen to two? Not a chance, right? This goes to something that Keith said. You let your arms be natural. All right. Now, I'm not going to say too much more about arms because he said a lot, and he said a lot about hands. But let me just point out a study that absolutely blew my mind. There's a researcher named Vanessa Van Edwards who looked at TED Talks. You've all seen a TED Talk? And they counted the number of hand gestures in the videos. And then they asked, okay, how many views do these videos have? And they looked at two different categories of videos, the most watched and the least watched. The least watched videos had some average of 272 hand gestures. The most watched videos had 465. What this means is that there was a correlation that twice the amount of hand gestures somehow correlated to 70 times the amount of views. Yikes, right? Except they sat viewers down and they actually did a survey where they asked them to rate the credibility of the speakers. Guess what? Those credibility ratings were the same regardless of whether or not the viewer had the volume turned on. That's freaky. Let your hands go. You have a powerful gun. Don't holster it. I bet you if you watch the video from every speaker here this morning and today, you'll watch their hands flying all around. I was watching from the back. Keith also talked about tone, so I won't say much other than to refer to another amazing study that blew my mind about tone. There's a doctor by the name of Stephen Chichi. You might have heard of him because he famously taught us that children are suggestible to false memories. He teaches at Cornell. And in the 90s, they were terrified of student evaluations, so they tried to blow up the student evaluation set. And what they did is they taught the exact same course twice. They taught it in the fall and they taught it in the spring. Same exact lecture content, same textbook, same homework assignments, same tests. The students rated him and his lecture performance 1 full standard deviation higher. Okay. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention the critical fact that in between the semesters, the only thing that changed is he went and got some training, and they taught him to modulate his voice more. So as I told you, the students rated him in the second year or the second semester 1 standard deviation higher in his performance in the lectures. If that were all I told you, no problem, great. These students rated him 1 standard deviation higher in every category. They actually rated the homework assignments and the freaking textbook higher. Think about what that means for you when you're giving an opening statement. Your credibility in just how you manage your tone can increase how the jury is going to look at your witnesses and your objections and everything that's associated with you. Okay. Now, your first words in an opening statement, here's my legal advice to you. Remain silent. Use silence. Silence is extremely powerful. It shows confidence. It builds mystery and tension. Don't say anything. But more importantly, please do not please the court. And do not please the prosecutor. You will please the court when you get up and tell an interesting story. And they can wake up for the first time in the trial and be like, oh, okay. And don't please the prosecutor. You know, if the prosecutor were trying to throw your best friend over a cliff, would you intervene, or before you intervene, ask for their pleasure? No, you wouldn't. So you got to figure out how you're going to start your opening. And that's a big part of, I think, crafting an opening statement. And I've heard many, many, many times that we need a hook. But I've always been bothered by that metaphor because I don't know about you, but I've never gone fishing successfully with just a hook. You need to bait the hook. How do you bait the hook? Well, there's a number of ways to do it, but the number one rule, as Keith said, is always be interesting. I'm going to give you a couple ideas. First, you can use rhetorical devices. What are rhetorical devices? They're like little pasta extruders for words. You stick your words in there and then they come out with these little delicious tiny morsels that you just want to eat. We know a bunch of them: alliteration, rhyming. We're familiar with many of these. Here's a couple that I really like. I have some in the written materials. In order to not run out of time, I'm going to kind of move quick. Antithesis, where you juxtapose opposites. So it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. I'm not even going to be able to pronounce these Greek words correctly. Anadiplosis, I think, where you repeat the last word of the preceding clause. The general who became a slave, the slave who became a gladiator, the gladiator who defied an emperor. How about this one? Epistrophe, I think. Repeat the ending word or clause. Yes, we can. Right? We're all familiar with that rhetorical tool. Hendiades. This is cool. You take an adjective noun phrase and you turn it into a noun and a noun phrase. So, like, for example, William Faulkner, instead of saying a furious sound, said a sound and a fury. But the one I really like is take a reasonable doubt and make it a reason and a doubt. But my personal favorite is chiasmus because I just love it. You basically reverse the other phrase with a mirror and it just pops. It's like the word order changes, right? And we know these phrases. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. All for one and one for all. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. These are amazing tools, and people remember these things for a reason. Metaphor and analogy. Let me say something quickly about this, because yes, this is a rhetorical device, but man, are these powerful. Why are they so powerful? I'll tell you what. I'll tell you a story. When I first heard, the very first opening statement I heard was at the University of Cincinnati when I was in mock trial, and an older student came down to give us a demonstration of what an opening statement should be. And it was a police brutality case. And he told a story about him and his wife going to the horse races. We were close to Kentucky. And seeing these horses with these little black things around their eyes. Blinders. And he told us that that reminded him of this case. I don't remember anything he said after that. But I've never forgotten that analogy. It was powerful. And I think this works so well because when we hear someone use an analogy or a metaphor, we get really excited about, are they going to be able to connect this up? And then when they do, you're like, wow, that was interesting. And also, it kind of does a little bit of a give and take, right? Like on the one hand, I'm talking about X, but I'm going to take you aside over here and tell you completely what seems like an unrelated story. It's a bait and switch. It's like pinching someone before you stick them with a needle, which is a metaphor or a simile. You can bait the hook with a critical scene. You can jump into one of the major critical scenes of your case. Every case has 2 or 3 critical scenes. These critical scenes are the moments in the story when all of the major elements are coming together and they're heating up. And all the tension is really high and people are really excited. And that gets people involved in the story right away, and then you can back up and you can progress up to it. What do I mean by mystery and suspense? Mystery and suspense means you introduce a few elements, but you hold back a few of those other elements that we talked about. So here's an example from literature. Some years later, on a tugboat in the Gulf of Mexico, Joe Coughlin's feet were placed in a tub of cement. Yeah, I'm ready to go on that story. Tell me more about that. Right? There's a lot of danger and there's a lot of risk involved there because cement and feet and water usually doesn't end well. Your father picks you up from a prison in a stolen Dodge Neon with an 8-ball of Coke in the glove compartment and a hooker named Mandy in the back seat. Yep, I'm ready for the next sentence. Are you? Well, I want to know about this dad. He sounds interesting. Here's one I used in a trial. The only witness who could see the truth was hiding across the street in the corner, high up, attached to a building, silently watching as the monster was about to blow. Now, the monster was my client because that's what they made him out to seem like, except when you looked at the video, he didn't blow. Understanding tense is important in an opening statement, and I'm going to give you a quick demonstration of this, because tense controls intensity. So here's past tense with what many of us call legalese. Total nonsense. You should get rid of every scrap of it in your opening. The evidence will show that when Charlotte walked out of her apartment, she saw her assailant in the dark of the night. We don't need the evidence will show. The judge already told the jury that everything we're saying is about that. Here's straight past tense. When Charlotte walked out of her apartment, she saw her assailant in the dark of the night. Okay? Here's present tense. As Charlotte walks out of her apartment, she sees her assailant in the dark of the night. You just kind of feel your heart rate pick up just a little bit. That's what present tense does. And using present tense in opening is one of the most effective tools that I have found to tell a great story. But if you add details to this, you can really have some fun. As Charlotte opens her door, the faint light from her apartment is all that illuminates the darkness outside. The moon and stars lay hidden behind invisible clouds. The only sound is the wind whipping the trees. She closes her door, turns around, and faces her assailant in the dark of the night. I'm not going to talk about demonstrative aids because Keith did such an amazing job with that. Asking for the verdict. Have you ever been told you need to ask for the verdict? Okay. I never understood why. But in my opinion, you do need to ask for the verdict, and here's why. Because asking for the verdict means you bring the jury into the story, but it's really about the now moment. It's not about the future. It's about that moment right now. If you've told a compelling story in opening, that jury is on some very unsecure ground at this point. They don't know what's going on. They're not sure what the hell this is about. And this is where you bring them in and you define their role. You define what their goal should be, what their motive should be, what they need to be looking out for, what they should be careful about, what the risks and dangers are. And then you flip it with the theme to bring them into the picture. So let me give you an example of this that I used. So I had a case where I used the theme of windows of truth. And the idea there was that you look past the facade and you look inside and you get to see the truth. And I defined a bunch of things as windows of truth. Video, people's decisions and their actions. Okay. And in doing that, I told them at the very end, I said, doubt and you'll not be deceived. Focus on those windows of truth. Take nothing for granted. Assume nothing. Force them to prove this case to you beyond every reasonable doubt. And I'm confident you won't be deceived. That you'll become the last and most important window of truth. And in the end, you will speak that truth by finding this man not guilty, because that's what he is. So by bringing them in as a window of truth, I'm able to make their role clear to them. Okay. Not that long ago, I gave a closing or an opening statement that was very different from the first opening statement I gave, and I want to share that with you as I wrap up. I was telling a story in that case about a young lady who had been coming home from the bar where she worked, and I talked about her struggle and her struggle in life. I used a theme about getting a leg up because honestly, this girl could not get a leg up in her life. It was really sad. But when it mattered most, and it should have mattered in the freaking field sobriety test, she held her leg up for 30 seconds without ever moving. But it didn't, and I said because the police officer was just too concerned about getting his own leg up. That was sort of the theme I was playing with. That wasn't the best opening I've ever given. It wasn't perfect, but I did everything I've told you here today. I included all of these features. I told a story, and I did it in the way I've argued you should. When I looked in the back of the courtroom, there was someone in the back, but this time it wasn't a friend of mine. It was a group of students, young students, probably around freshmen in high school. And I left the courtroom because we took a break before they heard any testimony, and I only know what happened because in the back of the courtroom was my friend's dad, who watched what happened next. The judge called these students up to him. And he's the judge, so he stands up with his big black cape, and he's telling them about the court system. And then he asked them, and he said, well, you've seen the opening statements. Raise your hand if you think the defendant's guilty. And the students stood there, looking up. And not a single hand went up. Now that's kind of amazing, right? Because these kids came in primed to vote guilty. What do they know about the justice system? They know the defendants are guilty, prosecutors do the right thing, and judges, they're all good. But it's what happened next that really blew my mind. Because the second question he asked was, raise your hand if you think the defendant is not guilty. And every single one of them raised their hand. When I heard that story, I could not help but think about old Louie and that Cadillac right at the front of their minds where I had parked it. Now, I told you that I would share with you how Louie did it. The answer is Louie didn't do it. He's not some savant who knows how to find a parking spot at any time. He's human. But the story about Louie was so good that when we saw his car parked up front, we're like, damn it, Louie did it again. And when it wasn't up front, we just ignored it completely. The story became the reality. Let that be your lesson. Let your story be the jury's reality. Thank you all.